Well, hello there. I hope you're all having a failure. My name is Dylan, and it's currently raining outside. So that means we're going to do a little color grading walkthrough. We're going to be creating a Blockbuster look today. So in the first half of this video, we're going to be using the tools built directly into Final Cut. And in the last half, we're going to create a look with the color grading plugin, Color Finale 2 Pro. If you don't have the plugin, I would suggest watching the last half as well, because that plugin really allows you to create more professional looking color grades, way more than you can with just the tools built into Final Cut. So this is the shot we're going to be grading. It's a standard Rec 709 shot, meaning this was not shot in log. At least this clip right here is not a log clip. So we don't have to add any input LUT, any transform LUT. We can just jump straight into adding our contrast and saturation and go about creating the Blockbuster look. So the reference frame that we are going to be referencing from is from the movie Ambulance. I just watched this movie. I know I'm slightly late, but it was great. Really solid movie. And we have a complementary color scheme going on in this film. It's cyan and orange. However, the cyan tends to swing more towards green in a lot of instances. And you can notice it in the shadows, a little bit in the midtones. And then as we start to get into the highlights, we have more of a standard cyan look. And of course, they isolated the skin tones, made sure the skin was somewhat accurate. Of course, in films, skin is not always going to be on point. If you're creating a documentary or a YouTube video or whatever, usually you want your skin to be accurate. However, in films, you'll often notice skin is not an accurate color of skin. And that's just a stylistic choice. Let's go ahead and pull up our comparison viewer. So I already have this frame brought into Final Cut. And to bring up your comparison viewer, you'll press Control-Command-6. And all we're going to do here is save this frame right here. So the frame is automatically selected, I believe, but you can just go into your library and then you just hit Save Frame. So now we have our frame browser, which can hold up to 30 frames. And you can add lots of different movie frames, whatever you like right here. So that way you can get a nice back and forth and get a good comparison of the two shots. So first things first, let's go ahead and adjust our contrast and our saturation a bit. So I pressed Command-6 to bring up our color wheels. I'm going to press Command-7 to bring up our scopes. And let's bring up our waveform here. Bring this down so this is a little bigger. And this is the Luma waveform. So the Luma waveform measures only brightness. And let's do the same for our shot of Jake Gyllenhaal here. So let's look at the brightness of these two shots. So clearly this is much brighter. You'll often notice in films that the very brightest part of the shot is brought down sometimes to even 75 or 80 IRE. In this instance, this window right here is pretty bright. It's looking like it's about 94 or 95, and the shadows are closer towards 0, but they're not completely there yet. So what we're going to do is just shift the entire brightness of our shot by using our global exposure slider and just dropping this down here. And you can actually hold Option and make a more gradual adjustment if you want. So let's drop our shadows down a bit more so it's closer to matching the reference shot. I may even lower the brightness of the highlights a bit more, and we're really going to get a lot of our contrast by adjusting the exposure of our midtones here. So let's bring this down a bit. We'll increase the global saturation, so the intensity of color in our shot, and we're good as far as contrast and saturation. So what I'd like to do next is let's bring up our vector scope and just take a look at where our colors are sitting. So as you can see, his skin, assumedly, is right about here. So this is on the skin tone line. So we know that his skin is fairly accurate. Not in every part of his skin. Likely in the darker parts, it's going to be swinging off. It's probably more towards the yellow. But for the most part, his skin is on the skin tone line. And then we have the rest of the shot that's swinging more, a little bit towards cyan, but somewhat in the middle between cyan and blue. And if we look at our shot could match fairly well if we just shift everything more towards the center of the vector scope. And so in order to move our entire shot, we just go to our global hue slider. So this adjusts the color of our entire image, and we'll just swing it this way. So our entire trace matches up a little bit better with the trace of our reference shot. And let's park it right about there. And for now, I'm going to disable our scopes so we can see everything just a little bit better. So we have our contrast and saturation down. We shifted the overall color of our shot. And let's go about adding a little bit more of a complementary color look by adjusting the color in our highlights. So let's swing this more towards the same color as our reference shot, more towards cyan. And I'm kind of looking at this window, just trying to match this up as best as possible. And something to note is that with the color wheels, it's making a gradual adjustment to your entire image. So even though this says highlights, it's also affecting our midtones slightly and our shadows just a little bit. This is one of the things that the plugin Color Finale 2 Pro does well, is that it has not only primary color wheels, but log wheels, like in DaVinci Resolve. So you can just go in and make tweaks only to your highlights, only to your midtones, and only to your shadows. I'm going to hold Option here and just try and dial this in just a bit more. Right about there. Let's head to our midtones, and something to remember is that skin tones lie in the midtones. Now, because these are the primary color wheels, a push to our hue slider here is also going to affect our shadows and our highlights, so we can't quite get this color separation that we're seeing here. We could use a color mask. However, I don't like to use the color mask built into Final Cut because it tends to break apart your image. You start to get this breaking of different color pixels, and so that's why I prefer Color Finale 2 Pro for color masks. So let's just do what we can with our color wheels here. So let's take our midtones hue slider and let's push and warm up our midtones here by pushing towards orange. And all I'm doing is looking at Jake here, Mr. Gyllenhaal, and getting a good idea of where our skin should lie by just looking at our reference shot. And something about right there looks pretty good. We can even bring up our scopes and just double check. That's looking pretty solid to me. And let's go to our shadows and just bring in some green. And we're just going to ping pong this back and forth. So because this adjusts your image gradually, the primary wheels, we're going to have to kind of go back and forth here. So let's go right about there. And let's push more color in here. Something right about there I think looks pretty good. And actually I may shift our shot just a little bit to the right with our global hue slider. Okay, something I'd like to do is add another color curves. So this is what we have so far. And I'm just going to bring down the brightness even more of our highlights by dragging in the very top right corner of our curve here. And I'm going to make a point in our midtones where his skin is going to lie. And I'm just going to push up here. And this is going to give a little pop in our skin. And then I'm going to bring down our shadows just a bit. Create a little bit more contrast, a little bit more of a punch. Maybe even a little bit more on this contrast. And then bring up our very darkest shadows just to create a milkier blacks, which you'll see often in film. Let's go about switching this to cyan. Just pushing up in our highlights. So we're adding cyan by pushing up here. And then we'll go to our midtones and let's pull out some of that cyan so we can get some of that orange back. And just create a little bit more color separation between the midtones where his skin lies and our highlights here. And I will say I am seeing quite a bit of dark blue in the shadows, and if we want to match this up as best as possible, we should take that out. So let's go to our blue curve and let's pull down to subtract some of that blue in our shadows, and that already looks way better. Let's go about adding some finishing touches here. Let's bring up a hue sat curve. Let's go down to Luma versus Sat And let's go ahead and make some points in the very darkest part of our image here. So if you don't know what the Luma versus Sat curve does, it allows you to change the intensity of color in different brightness values. So a good way to clean up your image is to go about decreasing the saturation in the very darkest parts of your shot, and sometimes in the very brightest parts of your shot. Not always, but sometimes. So let's go ahead and decrease the saturation in our shadows here, the very darkest parts of our image. We're just going to do a very gradual drop off. Right about there. Let's do the same thing for our highlights. So something right about there. If I turn this off and on, you can see what it does. Yes, it does kind of take out some of that cyan that we have in the window here. So perhaps we could decrease our highlights just a bit. There we go. That's a little bit better. But then it also, if you notice in the darkest parts of our shot, it really cleans up our shadows and just sucks out all that contrast. All that saturation. Just makes it look significantly more professional. And actually, I'm going to do a bit less. Let's raise this. Okay, and then the last thing we'll do here is adjust our Sat versus Sat curve. This is a good way to balance out the overall saturation in your image. So this adjusts the intensity of color in different saturation levels. That seems confusing, I know. Basically, this right side is the least saturated areas in your image, and this left side is the most saturated areas. So you can decrease the most saturated areas by dropping this down. And we don't have a lot of saturation in our image, so I'm just going to drop this down just a bit. And let's raise the saturation on the least saturated areas. And then I may just fine-tune this just by adjusting the middle here. You don't want too much of an adjustment or it kind of starts to tear apart your image, but just a small drop. So we essentially went from this to this, which matches up pretty well, I think. It's not perfect, but we also didn't go in and use any qualifiers, any color masks, I mean. So a pretty solid job, I think, for the most part. So let's grade this same shot and try and match it as best as possible with Color Finale 2 Pro. So let's bring up our layers panel. First things first, we'll go to our log wheels and we will go to our offset wheel, which is essentially the same thing as the global wheel in Final Cut. So we're going to go ahead and adjust our overall exposure of our shot by just dropping the brightness of our shot here and just get it in a similar range. I'm going to leave this here for now. We're going to come back to this layer. Let's bring up a primary color wheels. And for those watching that don't have the plugin, something different about Color Finale is that it is a bottom-up order. So basically the newest layer is going to be at the top and the oldest layer is going to be at the bottom. This is opposite from Final Cut, and I don't know why they do this, but it's just something to keep in mind. So with the primary color wheels, these make big gradual adjustments to our shot, similar to the wheels built into Final Cut. So let's go to our gain, which is our highlights. We'll go to our exposure slider. We're going to drop this down just a little bit more. We're going to be adjusting the highlights of our windows by hopping back into the log wheels and adjusting our gain in there. But for now, let's go ahead and add a little bit more contrast by mainly adjusting our midtones here and just dropping this down. Something right about there. We're going to create another contrast adjustment by using our color curves, specifically our Luma curve, but for now, let's just leave this as is. And then we can even just adjust our overall saturation, just bump this up. Okay, so let's rename this. Right click, rename. Call this contrast. Wow, I can't type today. Contrast sat. Let's hop back into our log wheels and let's bring down the brightness of our highlights here. And you notice because these are the log wheels, it compartmentalizes these different Luma ranges. So the highlights, the midtones, and the shadows you can adjust separately, more so than you can with the primary color wheels and the color wheels built into Final Cut. So you can see right here, moving this up and down, that this is adjusting the level of our highlights pretty much independently from our midtones and our shadows. Whereas if we hop in here and we adjust our highlights, it's moving our entire shot. So another pro of using Color Finale 2 Pro. So I think right about here looks pretty good. And let's bring up our vector scope because we're going to go about making an overall push to our shot, similar to what we did with the tools built into Final Cut. So you see the trace of our shot on the vector scope is kind of swinging more towards the upper right quadrant of our vector scope, more towards the magenta and the blue. We want to swing it back down towards the bottom left. So let's take our offset, the hue slider in the offset, and we'll just push this towards the bottom left. Try and match it up. Something, I think, right about there. We'll leave it right about here for now. We may come back to this, but let's go in and adjust this. Let's just call it exposure offset. And let's minimize our scopes. Okay, so we're going to create a color mask and really isolate our subject's skin and start to create some color separation from the background and really make our image pop. So let's bring up 2 log wheels and you're going to group them. So you'll right click, so you select both, and then right click this. We'll hit group. All right, we could even rename this. We could just call it color mask. And then you're going to go ahead and hit your mask button here. Click this. We'll go to our HSL so we can select just his skin, and then that's going to allow us to go in here and adjust the skin separate from the background. So we can actually take one of these, right click, let me move this up so you can see, and invert it. So now we have one that will select the skin, one that selects the background. So let's click on our mask again. Let's go HSL. We will make a selection of his skin, and let's change the display to composite mask. I may need to raise this so you can see this a bit more. Okay, switch this to composite mask, and let's start seeing if we can make a better selection of his skin. As much of his skin as possible without selecting the rest. Okay, something right about there. I think we're going to get a lot with this, yeah. Okay, so right about there, and then maybe even give us a wider range by adjusting these bottom parameters. Let's bring this in just a little bit. Okay, and the thing that separates this over the color mask in Final Cut Pro is the ability to blur the mask. This makes all the difference in the world. So, if we hop into the log wheels and we go to this one, which is inverted, so it affects everything outside of that mask that we just made. So we can go to our offset, so it adjusts everything, all the Luma values outside of the skin. And we are just going to push the hue or the color towards the color of what we see in our reference shot. So towards cyan, but a little bit towards green. Let's push a lot and we're going to dial it back. Okay, something right about there. Yes, this is a lot, but we're going to go about adjusting this in a bit. And I'm going to swing our highlights so I can try and match up the color of this window with the color of that window as best as possible. I think something about there. And we can even maybe go in the shadows and just slightly push away from the cyan that we've pushed into this, but we're going to adjust this in a bit. So if I zoom in here, you can really notice that our shot is breaking apart. And this is the downside of the color mask in Final Cut. But if we hop in here, go to HSL mask, and just add some blur, ooh, look at that. It just smooths it out completely. So now we can back out, and it just looks infinitely better. So much better. So with that out the way, let's make some more tweaks. So I'm going to add another curves, put it outside of our mask so it affects over top of the mask. Go to our Luma curve here, which adjusts our brightness, and we're going to decrease the brightness of our shadows just a little bit, create just a bit more drama, and then pop up our midtones, create a little bit pop in our midtones here. You notice that that's giving a little bit more pop on his skin. Yes, a little bit in the highlights, but we're going to adjust that as well. So let's go to our highlights, the very brightest point, and let's bring this down just a little bit. And this just flattens out our highlights, which is something common that you'll see in film. So this is what that did. If I turn this off and on, So it really helped to dial in the look a little bit closer to our reference shot. I think we maybe should go in and take out some of this royal blue that I'm noticing in the shadows. But I think we can probably adjust this by bringing up our HSL curves and taking out the saturation from the very darkest parts of our shot. So let's rename this. Rename additional contrast. Okay, we will go to Sat versus Luma. Select these points to make a selection of the very darkest parts of our shot. We'll change this to smooth. So now this gives us a nice gradual slope off here. And we'll drop this down. Okay, and maybe just something very light for our highlights. Change this to smooth. And this did kind of take out some of that blue that we were seeing. But if you really wanted to, you could hop into your hue versus hue curve. So this changes the color of whatever color you want. And maybe select the blue right here, and let's zoom in just so we can see just a bit better if this is making the adjustment that we want, and just swing this. It doesn't look like it is. Let's push this up. There's the adjustment we want. So something, I want to actually anchor this. So let's put 2 more points here just so it's a little bit, okay, yeah. Right about there. We want it to swing towards green. Let's zoom back out. That maybe is too much. And I may even bring up another log wheel and go in and just push more of this blue to try and match up the windows just a bit more. And actually, I may even go into that contrast and just darken it even more. Maybe a little bit more of a punch. Maybe a little less right there. So we just went from this shot to this one. Our skin looks pretty accurate. We have similar color ranges, looks cinematic. We have dim highlights. We have kind of milky shadows, some fairly high contrast. We have a decent amount of color separation, some anxiety in the shot with a complementary color look that's not so much cyan and orange as it is more of a little bit green and more yellow in a way with his skin. So almost gives a sense of unease. And at least with this movie, that went a long way because it just was action-packed and nonstop. So thank you guys so much for watching. I truly appreciate it. If you're interested in learning way more about color grading, both with the tools in Final Cut and Color Finale 2 Pro, check out the FCP Color Grading Masterclass. There's a link in the description that shows you what it's all about. And I hope you guys have a great rest of your day.